Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Chapter 7 about measurement and assessment, and then Chapter 8 all about data collection. So Chapter 7 goes into measurement and what measurement is. And when we're thinking about measurement, we are typically thinking about quantitative design or mixed methods design when we have variables that we want to measure. So measurement is all about the process of assigning a symbol or a number or a value to come up with a definition for a particular variable. So like I mentioned, it is essential in quantitative research because it's how we define our constructs or variables that we are using to make our hypotheses about and to test our hypotheses. So in education, there are a variety of different constructs that you might want to measure. So these are things that could be your variables. Things like shyness, student engagement, student achievement, activity. So those are some of the constructs that you might want to measure. If you have a variable that you know that you want to include in your research proposal, feel free to share what construct or variable you are thinking of putting in your proposal that you would need to measure. So there are 4 different scales of measurement that you're going to read about in the chapter. And these are how we can think about the types of variables we will be collecting and the types of scale that you will use. So a nomial scale is associated with categorical variables. So think back to the beginning of the text when we learned about the different types of variables, quantitative variables versus or numerical variables versus categorical variables. Your nomial scale are those categorical variables, things like gender, ethnicity, school type, political party, that don't have a number, but you can assign them a number and that becomes your variable. An ordinal scale has your ordered categories, but it's not an equal interval, such as class ranking. So one of the weaknesses with these scales is they don't tell you how much higher or lower. So that's okay. You can still use this type of scale, but it's important that you understand how it works in order to interpret it correctly. And an interval scale has equal intervals, but no true point zero. So one that you can think of in education, if you are a K-12 teacher, is the Georgia milestones. Those GMAS scores are interval scales. And then a ratio score does have a true zero, so you can do all 4 math operations with them. So things like weight, height, or the raw number of test questions answered correctly on an assessment. So when you are going about choosing a test or a measurement, or even using quantitative research to begin with, these are the 7 assumptions that underpin the use of testing and measurement in general. So the first is that psychological traits and states exist. Things like personality, I know that I mentioned shyness, for instance, extroversion, that these traits and states actually exist and that they are measurable. And another assumption is that major decisions should not be made about an individual based on one test. I think that all of us can agree to that. And that there are always various sources of error present when you are dealing with testing and assessment. And so those errors don't have to do with bias, but they have to do with whether or not you see a relationship and there isn't one, or if there is a relationship, but the test tells you that there's not. So those are some of the errors that we are referring to. Then also that the traits and states that can be measured can be used to predict non-related test-related activities. So if the test says that you are extroverted, then that would predict how you would behave in a real life setting. That an assumption is that it's possible to develop fair and unbiased tests, and that standardized testing and assessment can benefit a society. So these are the underpinning assumptions of testing and assessment. And if you have tensions with these, then perhaps a different design, such as qualitative, might be more appropriate for you. So when we are evaluating and choosing tests and assessments, there are 2 major aspects to consider, and that is its reliability and the other being its validity. And so we learn in our text that it's important to collect evidence that a measure is reliable and collect evidence that it is valid. So this is reliability, and reliability is all about ensuring consistency. You want your test or assessment to be consistent over time in that it is giving you consistent results. So I put this little like oven time thermometer in there because I guess a timer could work too, but an oven thermometer because you want that thermometer to give you consistent measurements to make sure that if you're a baker, your baked goods are turning out consistently by making sure that you are maintaining that consistency over time. So here are some of the dimensions that encompass reliability. So test, retest. Sometimes you take a pre-test and a post-test. So making sure that they are measuring or they're having a consistent measure. Equivalent forms, if there are multiple versions, version A, version B, that those forms are consistently measuring the same thing. Interconsistency reliability, making sure that the different items on the test are measuring the same construct. And then in some instances, there are multiple scorers. And so establishing inner score reliability, consistency amongst the different scorers. So reliability, think consistency, that measure is giving you consistent results in that sense. So accurate in terms of being consistent. That same test gives you those results over and over again in all scenarios. Now, validity evidence has to do with accuracy. Is your test or measurement accurately measuring the construct that you hope to be measuring? So if you are trying to measure student engagement, a test would be valid if there's evidence that it's actually measuring that construct that you hope to measure. So here are some the dimensions of validity evidence. The content, does it cover all aspects of that construct or trait? Internal structure, do all of the items also measure that same trait or construct? And does it correlate with the relevant outcomes? So you really want to have both of these. It needs to be both a consistent measure and an accurate measure. And so it's possible that it's consistent, but not valid or accurate. And it's also possible that it could be accurate, but not so reliable. So those are the two dimensions that we think about. Now, in terms of how we establish reliability, reliability is established through statistical methods. You'll find this table in the text, and here you can see the different type of reliability and the different statistical procedures that are used to establish that reliability. So this is something that you can identify if you are using a test or a measurement, an established one, is you can look at the reliability, the statistics that they ran to get the correlation coefficient that is indicating the reliability. Now, when we talk about different types of tests or assessments, here are some of the types that you will see discussed in the chapter. The first one being intelligence tests, measuring cognitive ability or IQ tests. Then we have personality tests that are measuring a particular set of traits that people have. Achievement tests are related to mastery of content taught, and then aptitude tests are focused on information gained through informal learning. So those achievement tests, again, you can think about Georgia milestones. The aptitude test, you can think about something like the GRE or the ACT because it is supposed to measure your aptitude it's supposed to predict your aptitude in, say, college or graduate school. So that kind of goes back to one of the underlying principles, assuming that these measures will predict future behavior. So not only informing learning, but also decision making. So here are some of the tests that you might consider using if appropriate for one of the variables in your research proposal. So if you want to go about finding reliable tests, there are a variety of different ways. I would again, and in the text they go into detail about these, I would again encourage you to check the journals at Georgia State. There is a way for you to search for tests or measures that you could propose to use in your study. If you are thinking of using a test to measure a particular construct or variable, you can check there. Now, some people have mentioned that they are interested in action research, which I think is great. Now, action research will also involve using tests and assessments, because action research is all about going through a cycle of identifying a problem or an issue in your practice, and then coming up with a proposed intervention that you could use to address it, collecting data to measure it, and then evaluating how effective you were. So in action research, you might be using teacher-created tests, you might be using standardized assessments as discussed in this chapter, but it is important to think about some of these elements when you are thinking about tests. So here is an exercise that you can think about if you are thinking about proposing a quantitative research proposal, and help you think about some of the variables that you might need to measure and how the ideas in this chapter could impact your study. So you can start by thinking about some of the variables that you are trying to study. Maybe it is number of minutes studied per night, or number of minutes practiced might be a variable. That is something that that would be a numerical variable. And then maybe you have something like perseverance, or a trait like that, or a trait like stamina, like in an academic setting. And so that might be a variable that you need to measure. So then you can go ahead and think about the different function of your variable. Is it the independent variable, dependent variable? And again, go back to the first set of chapters that we read where we learned about these different variables. And then if there's an existing instrument, like an existing test or assessment that you are thinking of using, what would that be? Or if you need to create a new test or measure to collect data about that construct, what would that be? What type of measurement scale is it? A nomial, ordinal, interval, or ratio? And then what evidence do you have of that measure's validity? And again, if it's an established one, you can find that by the authors of that test or measure. They have run the statistical procedures to give evidence of that reliability and evidence of validity. Okay, so that is chapter 7. Now, chapter 8 is all about data collection, and this is really getting into the fun part of thinking about your research proposal. So you've started to think about your research topic, the topic that you're interested in, thinking about a problem that's located within that topic, and then a specific research question that you could use to sort of center your study. So we are moving into how you would go about designing a study to collect data to address that question or answer that question. So data collection is important to think about no matter the type of study you're going to do, whether it be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. It's the foundation of all empirical research. We know empirical means based on observation, and those observations are made through the data that we collect. And so thinking about and having a very well thought out data collection plan in your research proposal is a really big indicator of the research quality. And it encompasses so many of the dimensions in terms of reliability and validity that will lead to stronger findings. So here in red, you will see the 6 major methods of data collection, and some of these are broad, and within them, there are many different subtypes in there. So this is a broad overview of how we can generally categorize them. But if you have specific questions about a more niche data collection method, please let me know, and I will be happy to offer my thoughts and resources on that. So the first one is tests. That's what you read about in chapter 7, those established tests that you can use to gather data. So this is, so I'll go into depth about each of these. I'll save for when I have the slides. We have questionnaires, we have interviews, focus groups, observations, and then constructed secondary and existing data. And most of these different data collection methods can be used in quantitative ways, in qualitative ways, or in a mixed manner. So I'm going to go through those when I go through each of these, and make sure that you pay attention to that in the text too, because this chapter is relevant for everyone, because all designs are covered in here, and even within the different data collection methods. So before we go into detail about that, I want to make sure that you understand the difference between a research method and a data collection method. So I want you to think of, and I wish I would have made the slide look like this, but so I want you to think research methods is the broad umbrella. This is your overall study design that you are going to use to carry out your study. And then data collection methods is underneath that umbrella. It's an aspect of your larger research method or research design. So research method guides your overall design. Data collection methods are the tools that you will use to gather information. And so under this umbrella of research methods or your research design, we will learn about in this course several different aspects, one of which is data collection methods. And you kind of already read about reliability and validity. That's another aspect, methods to establish that. And then also data analysis methods we will get to as well. So some examples of research methods are experimental research, survey research, case study research. So we learned about these different research methods in the second chapter, in chapter 2 as well. So if you need to look back and refresh yourself with the different research methods, those are there. Now, data collection methods are those specific tools, the 6 that we are going to cover in this chapter, like tests, interviews, observations. So let's get into these different data collection methods. Oh, before we do that. So mixing methods of data collection, there's been a lot of interest in mixed methods. And so this chapter does offer some insight in how you might go about designing a mixed method study. So when you are doing mixed methods, you could do inter-method mixing, meaning that you are using 2 or more different types of data collection methods. So this is an example here of inter-methods mixing. If you are conducting a mixed method study on student learning, you might have test scores, quantitative, those are quantitative, qualitative teacher interviews, and then classroom observations that are a mixture of both qualitative and quantitative. And then intra-methods mixing is when you use a single method in both a quantitative and qualitative way. And so here you can see the classroom observations were conducted in the mixed way. And so in this method, you would only use that one data source, but use it in multiple ways. So, and this was also talked about in the beginning of our chapter, but this idea comes up again in chapter 8, that the fundamental principle of mixed research is that using multiple methods will strengthen your findings. So let's go into the first data collection method, which is tests. So tests are your standardized or researcher developed assessments that are used for evaluation. So everything that was covered in chapter 7 is an example of a test. So achievement tests like SAT or your state assessments. Aptitude tests could be the MAP assessment. It could be IQ tests or GRE scores, or then your diagnostic tests that are used to diagnose. And then they can also be teacher-created tests or assessments. They could be curricular-created tests or assessments, end-of-unit assessments, something of that sort that would help you measure or define a variable. There's also tests that could measure a construct like personality construct or something like that. So tests are most often used in quantitative research, but they can also be included in mixed method studies as well. So questionnaires. Questionnaires are when you have a written set of structured questions to gather information from your participants. And there are 3 different types of questionnaires to match the different research methods or research designs. So we have a quantitative questionnaire. So a quantitative questionnaire are close-ended questions. Could be multiple choice. It could be Likert scale. You might hear survey research. Survey research is a type of quantitative questionnaire where the questions are close answered and you can assign a number to the participants' responses. Now, a qualitative questionnaire has open-ended responses. So in this type of questionnaire, the participant will be writing their own responses. It won't be multiple choice. And then a mixed methods or a mixed questionnaire would include some closed-end questions and some open-ended. So you can see how a mixed questionnaire could be used as the single data source for a mixed method study if you included both types. Interviews. So similarly to questionnaires, there are different types of interviews. Now, interviews are similar to questionnaires. Questionnaires and interviews are both gaining information from the participant by asking them a set of questions. Questionnaires are written. It could be physical copy, most often digital. And then interviews are verbal through direct questioning. So interviews are most commonly used in qualitative or mixed method studies. However, you can use structured interviews in quantitative studies. So for instance, a poll where someone calls you on the phone and they ask you a set of questions that are close-ended. Though we live in a swing state, so I think that we're likely have participated in this type of quantitative interview. So when we are thinking about the type of interview, like I said, it's most often used in qualitative or mixed methods. Here are some of the different types that you'll read about in the text. So a structured interview is when you have your predetermined set of questions, and that is what the researcher is to ask with no deviations, and typically the responses are close-ended. So if you are using an interview as your data collection source, you need to explain what kind of interview that you're going to do, and then also list the kinds of questions that you would ask in your research proposal. We call that a interview protocol. A semi-structured has the list and interview protocol of questions that will plan to be asked, but there's room for follow-up discussion, and it allows for open-ended responses, and the researcher does what we call probing, where they ask follow-up questions to encourage the participant to elaborate more, to share their experience. So interviews are great if your research question focuses on understanding the participant's experience or perception on something. And then unstructured is the most conversational, where you have a general list of topics that you want to discuss, but you can deviate from the script of questions. So those are the type of interviews that you can have. Like I mentioned, when you are proposing interviews, you need to have your interview protocol, which is your list of questions or things that you would like to talk about. And then the data source that goes with this data collection methods is your interview transcript. Focus groups are similar to interviews in that they elicit participants' perceptions about a topic based on a set of verbally asked questions. However, it has a moderator and a group of participants all together at the same time, generally 6 to 12, and together as a group, they can explore their thoughts and ideas about a specific topic. It's a valuable qualitative method to understand group perceptions, and the researcher would serve as the moderator, have their list of questions, which like their focus group protocol, and use those questions to guide the conversation. Observations. So observations can be conducted both quantitatively or qualitatively. So observations are watching and recording the behavior. In either a natural setting or a structured like laboratory setting. So here you can see one type of interview is naturalistic observation in real world settings, like at a sports practice or a sports game or in the classroom. And then a laboratory setting would be maybe you call athletes into the lab and observe them perform a certain set of exercises, or you bring students into a particular space and ask them to do a particular task and observe them in that controlled setting. Maybe that you ask them to do like an art piece. And so you have them come into like a special, that wouldn't be like a laboratory, but like a special like art area where they are conducting this for the purpose of the study versus just being in their normal art class. So when we think about observations, a quantitative observation is, sometimes I call this a structured observation, because you go into the observation with in mind what it is you want to observe. So for instance, if you are observing student engagement, or maybe you're looking at how the teacher interacts with students. So you might go in there, you would have like a rubric and you would tally the number of times the teacher does a certain thing, like how many, like one example is like talk time. How many minutes is the teacher talking versus how many minutes are the students talking? That would be a structured observation because you're watching and recording, but you're counting what's happening. So that is a structured observation. Now, a qualitative observation is open-ended. This is in a naturalistic setting. It's associated, like I mentioned, with qualitative research, particularly ethnography, and the researcher goes in and they observe and they take detailed field notes. The field notes are their data source. And then there's different types. So you see participant observation here. So when we think about the range of different types of observations, one way to think about it is how involved the researcher is with the setting. Now, this is in terms of naturalistic observation. So sometimes the researcher could be a complete observer. They're not interacting with what's happening at all. Sometimes they're observer as participant. They have limited interaction, but they might be engaging with the community a little bit. Participant as observer, they're an active participant and they also observe. And then a complete participant, they are fully immersed in whatever is happening. So I want us to take a look at an example of a structured observation so you can get an idea for what this looks like in practice to use a quantitative observation.
There are many, many social contexts that are having impact on us in any given day. The ones we're aware of that are making a difference for our behavior, it's only a fraction of what's actually influencing us.
In this study, we were most interested in the foods and beverages depicted in the most popular American movies from the last 25 years. So between the years of 1994 to 2018, these were movies like the Harry Potter movies, the Twilight series, a lot of Disney movies. We watched those movies and we just recorded every time that we saw a food or a beverage depicted.
Each of these foods were coded for their nutrition, content, and quality. And then those contents and qualities were compared against several different standards, including federal dietary guidelines.
Across the board, the foods and beverages depicted in movies fail U.S. dietary recommendations. So they're depicting more salt, fat, and sugar than what we should be eating, and particularly more alcohol than what we should be drinking.
There have been many studies in the field that show that just mere exposure to something, just having it enter your sphere of awareness over and over is enough for you to develop a positive association with it, to start to like it.
So when you see characters like superheroes or your favorite actors consuming foods, that can subtly influence our behavior, in part because they shape our mindsets about food, what's delicious and exciting to eat.
Of course, some movies have specific settings. If you're showing a diner in the 1950s, it probably makes sense to show burgers and fries, but there's many times when the food or beverages depicted in movies aren't really relevant for the plot. And those are places where we could maybe be more mindful about the types of foods and beverages we're showing.
I think it's a really great opportunity for movie producers and actors to be empowered by these findings. Also to take more of a responsibility for the foods they portray on their screens for millions of people to see.
That was a structured observation. So the last type of data is constructed secondary or existing data. And so this again can be used with quantitative, qualitative, or mixed design. So let's talk about constructed data first. So constructed data is when the participants construct something or make something as part of the study, like a student artifact, or if you are observing a group's political process, it might be a brochure that they made. So something constructed by the participants. Then we also have secondary and existing data. This is data that was not originally collected by the researcher, but that they can use to help them answer the research question, like government records, like the census or school reports, could be data from archived research studies, personal documents, historical records that exist there. So that is constructed secondary and existing data. There's also when you think about observations, qualitative observations, you can have artifacts like photographs, potentially even video, or just other artifacts to help you understand the context that you are setting. So that is constructed secondary and existing data. So I want to show you an example of using existing data and how that can be helpful in answering a research question.
Most people, the interaction that they're going to have with a police officer is because if they're stopped for speeding or forgetting to turn their blinker on. There have been so many different interactions with police that have ended tragically. There was the arrest of Sandra Bland in Texas in 2015 that ended up with her dying in jail. There was the Minnesota stop with Philando Castile where he was shot and killed. Those are really egregious incidents. What is the everyday person's interaction with police like, and do we have problems there?
Our project started a couple years ago when we requested state-level records from all 50 states on traffic stops.
When research is done on just one particular jurisdiction, one city, or even one state, it's hard to draw larger conclusions about the state of policing in the United States.
We find that Black and Hispanic drivers are ticketed, searched, and arrested at higher rates than white drivers, even after controlling for location, age, gender, and year. The pattern is widespread, occurring throughout the country. These differences highlight a disparity in police practices. In and of themselves, these statistics do not, however, indicate discrimination. To go beyond these disparities, we test directly for bias in search decisions. We try to directly infer the standard of evidence that officers apply when deciding to search.
So for example, if officers search white drivers if there's a 10% chance or greater that they're carrying contraband, but search black drivers if there's a 5% chance or greater, this is going to be measured as discrimination.
Based on our statistical analysis, we find that there's a double standard. Black and Hispanic drivers are searched on the basis of less evidence than white drivers. At the end of 2012, both Colorado and Washington legalized recreational marijuana.
Since black drivers were more likely to be charged with drug-related offenses prior to legalization, the policy change mitigated racial disparities.
What's interesting is that the number of searches also dramatically declined in both states. In part, this is because legalizing recreational marijuana removed a common reason for conducting searches.
The data comes to you in a different format from every state. We came up with a standard set of columns, like the race of the driver, gender of the driver, age of the driver, whether a search was conducted, whether contraband was found.
There are a number of states around the country that collect information when a police officer stops an individual, but that data is not analyzed.
To help researchers, journalists, and policymakers explore these issues, we're releasing all of our data and all of the code we use to analyze the data. In total, we're releasing records for over 100 million stops across 31 states.
And providing the training to journalists so that they can think more effectively about how to cover race and policing.
This is just a first step in a complex process of understanding and improving police contact with the public.
Okay, so in that study you saw they talked about their research question, and in this video they really went through the whole process of identifying a problem and then coming up with a research question and then collecting using data, existing data that existed in the states. And another thing to note here is just because you collect data doesn't mean that you're doing research. So they talked about that in there too, and you can see how powerful using existing data can be to change policy. No, another thing in chapter 8 is the 2 cardinal rules of educational research is to use multiple methods of data collection when possible, not mixed methods necessarily, but try to use multiple methods of data collection when possible. And always think about validity. Are your data measuring what you are hoping to measure? And data is plural. So are the data measuring what you hope that they are? So as you start to think about data collection, I want you to think about your research proposal and what types of data collection methods are aligned with the research design that you propose, like quantitative, qualitative, or mixed. Which types would be most aligned? And then think about your specific research proposal, and if you have variables or if you have constructs, what are you trying to understand or measure? And what types of data collection would be most effective? And then what ethical concerns might arise with that data collection source or another data collection source? So I have for you here the research proposal template that is available in iCollege. So we will start working on this and you will turn it in the coming weeks. So this is the template for the final research proposal, but when you do your proposal outline, we're looking for your research issue, your research questions, your method, and we talked about method in this lecture, quant, qual, mixed, and there are subtypes there as well. And then you can start to think about your data collection sources and your data collection procedures. And in your research proposal, you will also discuss the measures you took to establish reliability and validity. And we will continue to read about those, but I wanted to show you the research proposal template so you can start to fit together what we're reading in the text to how that will correlate or correspond with your research proposal. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts and your ideas and your questions about data collection and our Chapter 7, tests and measurements.